I mean, I don't know what we're talking about, but
I mean, okay, nothing.
no, I'm joking.
You,
Well, I actually don't know what we're talking about, but we could start with the fact that I predicted Amy Coney Barrett before anyone else did.
is that her name? Is Coney?
I think so, unless, wait, yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know. How do you spell it?
Coney?
Yeah, Coney.
That's her middle name, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I knew it was like something with a C, but I wasn't sure what it was. Um.
You
Yeah,
saw that tweet, right?
I saw. I saw. Good
Yeah.
work. Good work there. Yeah, I think you were alone in 2018. No one had heard of her.
So, yeah, we should just share this with our listeners, what I did on Twitter. So, this is actually from September 27th, 2018.
Yeah.
So, almost exactly 2 years ago
Yeah.
to the day.
Um.
Um, and my tweet was actually very simple and without any context. So, people can't call me out for, they don't know what I was trying to say, but I said 3 words, colon, Amy Coney Barrett.
Right.
That's it.
Right. But I mean, what was the context? What was happening two years ago?
I don't fully remember, but I think that the point I was making was, why are conservatives standing by Brett Kavanaugh, considering how controversial, accusations, allegations, and all that? Why not go for someone who doesn't have those past controversies attached to them? Someone who has a pure record, at least in terms of moral comportment and their private life. So Amy Coney Barrett, a true conservative, conservatives lover, religious conservatives in particular. She's a serious jurist, all that stuff. Why not go for her? So, I mean,
And why do you think they didn't?
because I think Brett Kavanaugh became the rallying cry for even anti-Trump and never-Trump conservatives, that if they back down on Kavanaugh, liberals would sort of taste blood and want more, and so it became a power struggle. Really, it wasn't about whether or not the sexual allegations against Brett Kavanaugh were true or not. It was about, should conservatives back down, and if they do, what that means for the sense of liberal victory. And that would be a precedent that would be set from that point on, from their standpoint, that liberals could torpedo a nomination, and sort of shape the debate around Supreme Court justices and all that.
But of course, I mean, but nominations have been torpedoed before. It wouldn't have been the first time. I mean, my theory is that they just wanted to keep an anti-abortion woman ready to go to replace RBG, because they wanted to stick it in. That
Oh,
is to say
interesting.
that
I
it's
hadn't thought
like
of that.
you lose a woman, here's a woman back right at you, women. I think that's my theory.
But it's also a bit problematic, because then they're assuming that RBG would die during Trump's term.
Of course, that's what they were assuming. I mean, we were all
Okay.
waiting for it.
See, but I was caught off guard by RBG's death. I mean, I wasn't following the complications from her cancer, and so I didn't know that she was in that dire situation. So
Yeah,
I was
really. I mean, she almost died like 3 times before this year. Like little
really
boomlets.
almost died.
I mean, little news boomlets, like off she goes to the hospital for cancer treatment and stuff like that. And then
I don't
everyone was
read
like,
Damir. I don't
yeah,
read.
clearly.
But you know what? Like, I don't really have. It was just a joke on Twitter. I don't actually know a lot about her, except that the religious conservatives on Twitter that I follow think that she's amazing. The only opinion I really do have is that Democrats should not try to attack her on the basis of faith. I mean, that's something I've always been uncomfortable with, when Democrats try to impugn someone's character or their suitability for the court based on whether they are a practicing Catholic. That kind of religious litmus test to me is really problematic and emblematic, I think, of a bigger problem the Democrats have, where they just can't respect people of faith. And that puts off people who would otherwise support Democrats, but won't and can't, because they see Democrats as hostile to religion.
How's what's is there any doctrinal stance in Islam on abortion?
We're pretty chill on abortion.
Yeah.
I mean, relative to Catholics at least. So,
Yeah.
abortion is generally permissible during the first trimester.
Mm.
After that, generally not.
Yeah.
But most abortions do take place in the first trimester.
Right.
I mean, the bigger issue here would be, I mean, Islam has obviously a prohibition on premarital sex.
Right.
So it's an interesting question. Well, most abortions or many abortions in the first trimester happen outside of the context of marriage, right? So that's already haram or impermissible according to Islamic law, regardless of the specific abortion component.
Mm.
So the Islamic response would be people shouldn't be having sex in the first place before marriage, so they wouldn't get to the point of having to decide on whether or not to abort.
Yeah. Right. Right. I mean, you know, the thing about the religious test though, right? I mean, it's an abortion test. It's not a religious test exactly that Democrats are on about. I mean, it gets to the deeper point that making you know, well, Roe v. Wade, rather than it being something that again is should be sorted out in, you know, as a matter of legislation. It was made as a right, and therefore like non-contestable in a lot of ways. Whereas, you know, I don't know. I remember years ago there was an article in The Economist about looking at abortion legislation across like Western Europe, and you know, it's just it's a patchwork with various different restrictions, et cetera. Whereas, you know, the United States took this judicial road, and it's sort of poisoned everything from everything. So I mean, therefore now we talk about it as a religious test, but it's not a religious test; it's an abortion test, right? I mean, again, this is not my thing, so I don't. This is something I really very very casually look at from the outside.
You're right; it's primarily about abortion, but even if the abortion issue wasn't paramount, you'd still have concerns around gay marriage, around religious freedom issues. Of course, all those are ultimately tied to abortion, so it's hard to disentangle them in the current debate. But I think that if someone was a devout Catholic who had previously been open about their discomfort with homosexuality, I imagine that would be seen as disqualifying,
again,
putting aside abortion.
You know, this is again one of those things that where not my issue, don't follow it very closely. But even there, the idea, I'm gonna shoot from the hip now. If I remember correctly, there was a time where I think like basically the gay rights movement would have been fine to compromise on the idea of just don't call it marriage. So no one gets married. The state doesn't recognize marriages. It just recognizes all the rights that come with whatever kind of union. So there's something that's not called marriage. It's just some sort of, you know, union
civil
certificate.
Union, yeah,
civil unions, basically.
Even Obama supported civil unions and not marriage as recently as his first term.
But I think it was Andrew Sullivan that actually turned that around, and I don't remember the details of it. He then said it needed to be, because in fact social conservatives were blocking even that happening. So I think at some point he flipped it around. It's like, no, the real conservative case for gay marriage is one to make us all boring bourgeois schmucks, and therefore, you know, we all deserve to have the right. But in doing that, it made it a right, and so it became uncontestable. And now conservatives find themselves on the short end of that stick. It just the bigger point I want to make is that it's the recurring peril and mistake of throwing this to the courts, is that then it just pollutes everything. It just makes everything a question of rights and not debatable, basically.
And I'm coming around to that view. Sam Moyn had a really good piece in 2018 about how progressives have come to rely too much on the courts instead of actually winning voters over and persuading them that their positions are the right ones. And we've come to rely on unelected institutions to kind of get our way in public life and in cultural life. And by we here, I just simply mean folks on the left side of the spectrum. And I think that's had a damaging effect on how we do electoral politics. And what Sam Moyn argues for in this piece, basically, we'll include in the show notes, is progressives have to completely restructure their relationship to the Supreme Court. And I think that's become even more obvious in light of RBG's death, that if we can't protect abortion rights, if we can't protect equality for gays in America, then if we can't persuade people on the state level, then that's a problem, and that's a deeper problem that has to be addressed. And this sort of, the Supreme Court just comes and resolves these problems for us and essentially legislates. I mean, isn't that the conservative critique, that the courts do what Congress no longer does? And that's just untenable.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about, personally for me, it's been on my mind is basically, how far gone are we? On the one hand, I feel like the temperature keeps rising, right? I mean, the reaction your piece got is just sort of one part of it. Your piece of The Atlantic 2 weeks ago, but it's just this at least rhetorical escalation to near revolutionary talk. I might as well mention it now. Like our guest from last week, Nils Gilman, got in a bit of a mess on Twitter by tweeting what I think is ultimately an unfortunate tweet about Michael Anton. What that sort of drove to me is, like, I've known Nils for years, and I know that Nils does not condone political violence, but he found himself tweeting something that, it's kind of you'd have to really be, how do I put it? It's a political statement. Anything you tweet in partisan terms is political, and it was I think he was wishing that Anton would end up like this Nazi that was shot by de Gaulle after World War II, basically. So, whether it's explicitly a call for the execution of Michael Anton or a rhetorical flourish that went too far, doesn't matter. It's a sense of like rhetorical radicalization. So on the one hand, I feel like, that sort of snapped me to really thinking through, right now, how, you and I and a lot of our friends, I think we're convinced that generally, like the United States is a lot healthier than it is. And
the U.S. is a lot healthier. Say that one more time.
I think isn't the consensus that basically, the country's not on the verge of, at least that's maybe it's not the consensus
among our friends.
Our friends that the country is not on the verge of like proper revolution. That like a lot of this stuff is maybe overdone. Yeah.
We believe America is stronger and more resilient than everyone else on Twitter thinks it is, but who knows? Maybe I'm starting to doubt some of my own position in light of recent weeks, because I'm getting caught up in this rhetorical overreach. I see it every day, and it makes me think that American democracy is more threatened than it actually is. And I think I don't think my parents, for example, who are not on Twitter, I don't think it would occur to them that civil war is a real possibility. But that's the kind of rhetoric that elites are engaging in. But I wonder, if you're not engaging in that rhetoric, to what extent would you be aware that this discourse is happening among commentators and elites and all that?
But that's what I mean. I feel like on the one hand that the country's fine, and that, like, in fact, I think it's gonna be a blowout for Biden, and everyone's gonna shrug, and it's like whatever, and like it's basically because Trump is such a social media creature, and all of this just sort of happens in the confines of social media. It sort of stays there. But then I wonder, it's like, what is a revolution, right? It's not like the French Revolution. Every day shit was happening, and people were going around and throwing nobility and like hanging them off of light poles. And that would happen once every so often, and then you'd have nothing happen for months at a time. Or any of the unrest in the interwar period in Germany. It's not like it was day in, day out, just utter chaos. But it was just like sort of a steady escalation and a deterioration. And maybe it is this like, hermetic bubble that like your parents and 99% of Americans who, are going to vote and don't really follow this nonsense that we're engaged in here and we think is so important, they'll just cast their vote and be like, oh, Joe Biden won. Great. Don't like him, but whatever, like on with my life. And then life goes on.
Yeah,
Or something else is going on. And I wonder, I've been wondering this week, Shadi, whether you and I, observing all of this, would know that something was going on if it was going on, like something bad was going on, whether we'd be able to call it. And this is not to say that all the people that have been moaning about totalitarian America for the last 4 years are right, but I wonder whether there's a kind of mutual radicalization that is nevertheless happening. That's not like Trump is Hitler, but is more like, Trump is already the manifestation of a society that's pretty far gone. He's accelerated for the last 4 years, and we are in a worse place than you and I and a lot of people are, willing to even countenance.
So I'll be self-critical right now.
Go on.
I don't think I would be able to call it. If there was a revolution coming or an impending civil war, I would get it wrong, because under no real plausible scenario that I can envision now would I actually shift to the other side and say, shit, this is a real possibility of democratic breakdown and of America ceasing to be a full democracy.
Yeah.
I don't think in part because if I put my emotions to the side, I have a kind of broader structural outlook. I know from a political science standpoint that there has never been an old, long-standing democracy that has turned into an authoritarian regime outside the context of foreign invasion or occupation. So in that sense, it hasn't actually happened before. And if it did happen this one time, it would be quite literally unprecedented. So I think that even if we did have a civil war, I wouldn't necessarily regret my position, because I think my position is well-founded. Of course, there's always the 2 to 3% chance of something very unlikely happening, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that retroactively I would have been wrong.
Well, you're conflating something though,
Okay.
though, right? I mean, in the sense that civil war, I'm not talking about authoritarianism. I'm talking about civil war. I'm talking about breakdown. And now, yeah.
Authoritarianism is also democratic breakdown in this context, right?
But what I'm talking about is I mean, can't one have a proper, like when I'm saying authoritarianism may or may not emerge on the other side of prolonged disintegration. But we could still have prolonged disintegration where America ceases to be the America we know. I'm just saying, I think like the dichotomy between democratic versus authoritarian misses perhaps exactly what perhaps is happening, or maybe not.
We already have some level of disintegration. So in that sense, we both feel that something troubling is going on, maybe more so myself than you, where I actually look at this and I worry about a mass disillusion with democratic politics. And that's what prompted my Atlantic piece the other week.
Yeah.
Is that I already saw the real possibility that millions of Americans, millions of Democrats will lose faith in the premise of our democratic system. And that premise, to put it simply, is that political change is possible through electoral means.
Yeah.
So if that actually happens, if Trump wins and we have this mass disillusion, that's already going to be a sign of disintegration. Now, what that means in practice, what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, that's what I'm not really sure about. But I can certainly envision a scenario where a big chunk of the country disengages from the political process. It's not like they're going to take up arms. I mean, liberals don't have enough arms to take up. So that's not really a plausible scenario. And also, I don't think liberals should be engaging in fantasies of civil conflict because they're not well positioned in that fight.
Yeah. But here's the other part. I wonder if this is where we, like even that where you put it there. This is what I've been thinking about this week. Is like whether that doesn't like cloud me and you from really like obstruct our own ability to grasp what's happening. I think that's it. That's almost, and you see it. It's not just me and you. It's just everyone when they talk about like, oh my God, revolution, whatever. They have like sort of a cartoonish vision of what this looks like. Or even on the left when they're worried about disgruntled Trump supporters taking up their guns. Like a bunch of fat hicks with like AKs. You know how quickly you could put that shit down with the police? Like how quickly you just it's not, there isn't like a credible militia force on either side of civilians with guns to be able to do anything. We have a well-trained government apparatus that could wipe the floor with any citizen uprising anywhere, like super quickly, and restore order and restore democratic norms, however you want to put it, So
I'm with you, Damir, on that generally, but then I'm just now thinking about what a conservative might say to what you just said. They might say, well, hey, we have had a citizen uprising over the past few months. It's been largely peaceful, but there have been bouts of violence and destruction, property damage, all that.
Yeah.
And the government hasn't been able to get it under control in certain cities, and has been, and that to me is a good thing. I wouldn't have wanted the Trump administration to quote unquote put down a citizen uprising, but I think there is a question of the will to use force, which is generally good. We don't want our government apparatus to be using excessive force unless it's a last resort, unless quite literally the republic depends on it.
Okay, no, I mean, fine. All I'm getting at is that I'm not concerned about it. One way or the other, I'm just not concerned about it. My opinion on when one should put down these things or not, notwithstanding, I just don't think it's a realistic concern. So when people say the revolution's not happening because, or the revolution's about to happen because, either red staters with paunches and AKs, or I don't know what kind of like Antifa plus like New York Times editors will, like storm the Republic. And I don't think that's what it looks like. And that's what I'm getting at is that like what we're blinded to. It's let's be a little more pessimistic about it. It's like otherwise sensible people are issuing death threats on Twitter. At some point, and Biden's election doesn't necessarily need to lead to the end of this. At some point, some entrepreneur takes it to himself and kills some prominent elite person just like that on the street. And then, maybe there's some like tit for that. That's hard to contain, I would say. And then you start getting this kind of like violent factionalism coming up. That is, again, not like a serious threat, but is like an acid to everything. I'm just wondering whether this election, in fact, will solve anything. In my more optimistic modes, I'd saying like Biden wipes the floor with them. Maybe even trifecta, gets all houses, and then starts pushing through like a fairly ambitious left-leaning agenda, which allows then Republicans, chastened as they are, to say, wait, they've just vacated the center, and then they can regroup in the center as a strong opposition, come back in the midterms, take back the Senate, and perhaps even like claw back chunks of the House. I don't even know what it looks like. Maybe it's not really.
That sounds like a functioning democracy. I mean,
yeah,
that
right.
Sounds somewhat appealing.
No, that's the optimistic version. But what if in fact like this loss is just radicalizing for the right, and at the same time Biden's a failure because he can't keep the center? That's the part that I'm trying to think that like maybe this is what I have been missing, in the sense of thinking like how bad off we are. If in fact all this noise on social media and all this sort of sniping is not just venting and silliness and like COVID related, like stir craziness that is leading people to lash out more on Twitter than normally they would, like more irresponsibly than they would. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, but then we just end up with kind of what we have now, which is a slow and steady disintegration where something feels wrong, but we muddle through. The system functions to some degree, even if incompetently, and we get through it. And democracy doesn't fall apart. We just have this weird standoff, this kind of de facto pluralistic, de facto, this de facto agonistic, antagonistic state where people kind of hate each other, but they're not actually doing a whole lot about it in actual physical terms. People continue hating the other side. People continue freaking out on Twitter. You have disillusion with the democratic process. You have legitimacy undermined to some degree, but nothing completely falls apart.
But so that, I guess that's the thing. And maybe this is where you and I ultimately, I mean, I know this is where you and I ultimately maybe differ on
No,
this.
Damir, don't say that. No, wait, there's a place where we ultimately differ. You think it's that foundational?
Well, I mean,
Don't
it's a valuation sort of thing, because to you, I think, ultimate health is measured in the fact of whether we are or aren't a democracy. I think that's maybe a mistake to think about it in those terms. That is to say, I'm not going to say something like a vibrant autocracy is better than a dysfunctional democracy, but I will say but I will say that a dysfunctional democracy may not be viable. That is to say that is no, I don't think so, because I would argue to you, and this is to circle back to the Amy Coney Barrett thing and the whole sort of process of the last, this. I've written it. I've said it before. This is not about Trump. Trump is epiphenomenal to like a whole lengthy process of disintegration that's accelerated. That is to say, I don't know how you want to measure it. I've written about it and measured it that the end of the Cold War really kicked this off in a big way because the big challenge is gone. I think that's too simplistic. That's not everything. And, if you look at like Roe and all this stuff preceded it, the culture wars preceded Pat Buchanan's speech in 91. But, it's the question is, again, there's this belief like democracy is sustainable, et cetera, best outcomes. Maybe not. And this is not to say that they're better things. Maybe in the Churchillian sense, it's better than all the others, even though it's a fucking shit pile. But I wonder a couple of questions: whether a country as big as the United States, as diverse as the United States, and yeah, last week we talked about the virtues of federalism and devolving power down. But I wonder whether things as they're rigged up right now in the United States for all sorts of reasons maybe can persist as a deeply dysfunctional democracy for 10, 20, 30 years. But maybe we're, this kind of stuff at this accelerated pace, we're a failed state. Now, a failed democracy.
How? But why isn't what we have now, as tense and uncomfortable as it is, sustainable? Like, why couldn't we live in something resembling this state of affairs for the next 10 to 20 years?
We can. I mean, we may be forced to, but I think it would be a mistake to say that this is the new normal. I would say that we're on a slope downwards. So this plus more violence and just worse all the time. Like I said, imagine, that you just sort of start getting that assassinations happen more. That's just one thing that I think could happen. Political assassinations. We haven't had one in this country for a while, quite frankly.
But that already happened in the 60s.
Right. No, but
we survived. We got through it.
So I wonder if, well, for one thing, I don't know. Maybe we get like a Reaganist sort of revival, but there's a story to be told that it's been on a sort of downward slope since the 60s, that we sort of it rebounded, maybe stabilized and plateaued under Reagan. Maybe it was like, some sense of coming up, but then has been, through the prosperity of the 90s, that helped buttress it to a certain extent, helped keep it together. But now we're again on a path to dissolution. That may be what it is that kept this country together, was a cohesive sense among the elites who were WASPs, who were homogenous, that were able to keep it together for this long. That in fact, a certain level of pluralism, a certain level of discord on the scale of the United States, in fact, doesn't work. and we're headed towards something bad. And this is what I'm
Yeah.
saying. It's like if you're just saying, well, we're not an autocracy, we're a democracy, and therefore, yay, I think we might be missing something by saying that. That's all.
Hmm.
You don't need to have Hitler to be a failed state. You know, I guess that's what I'm getting at.
So Damir, I
yeah.
think that this might sound like a cliche in the context,
Mhm.
and we've said it, but I've said it before. I think that this applies to public life, but also to private life. And I think it's just something that people should keep in mind going forward, is that things are never as good as they seem,
Mhm.
and things are never as bad as they seem.
Yeah.
That what's generally likely in most scenarios is something vaguely and unsatisfactorily in the middle. And that's why I think that you're actually what you laid out earlier, I think is actually very compelling, and perhaps you should write something about it. That we might very well have a whatever moment, that in November or December we're all going to be freaked out, but things will revert to some kind of tolerable mean, especially if Biden wins, perhaps only if Biden wins. But a lot of people will say, hey, Biden won by a clear enough margin, and life goes on. And in a post-COVID moment, God willing, people can start to maybe focus more again on their personal lives, on just being normal people who aren't freaking out nonstop. People who have mental illness, who spend a lot of their time on Twitter, will end up getting the treatment they need. And I'm not even saying, no, I'm not even, I mean, obviously that can sound as a little bit snarky, that
Uh-huh.
I'm accusing my critics of being
Mentally ill. Yeah.
mentally ill. But again, like, I mean this seriously, that there are
You mean
people
it
who need
lovingly.
help. Lovingly. I want people who need the help to get the help.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the best case scenario. And I don't think I think it's more likely than the worst case scenario. And even talking to you right now is making me feel better about my country, about our country. That because I'm on Twitter, I try to limit my Twitter use, but I still go on Twitter every day and I see what people are saying, and I start to lose faith, and I have to protect myself against that. And that's why having a conversation like this is important, because it reminds me that, like, when you take a step back, it isn't actually as bad as it seems. That's what I would say. Obviously, there's a lot of people who would disagree.
Yeah. No, I mean, overall, I think that that's true, and I think most normies don't care to the extent that mentally challenged people on Twitter do. Not challenged, sorry, ill, different. um, but you know, again, it's just it's. I guess what I'm sort of pivoting to is that is a like maybe a longer time frame sort of sketch of health. And I again, I know your commitments to agonism and that being all that requires, but it's like it's you know the to me the some of these questions about self-determination, sovereignty, and democracies and things like that. Um, I don't know. I've said this before. It's like um, it is so much tied to identity and group identities and belief in some sort of group identity. But again, and God help me, the world is not the Balkans, but I do think that the Balkans have something to teach, especially the post Cold War idealist world, in the sense that again the attempt to architect the ideal, the post Cold War, we've learned from World War II and the Holocaust and kumbaya, let's all live together, failed in Bosnia. Now, again, it's not, people would argue it's not because the ideas were bad and flawed, but just the implementation was crap. There's a lot to it. The implementation was crap. But there's something still that always gnaws on me in this sort of stuff, that is that if you don't have a coherent identity, or if that coherent identity has been shattered, um, and that politics becomes dominated by sub identities, which is what has happened in Bosnia specifically. Um, it's just not going to work. It's just democracy doesn't work if you have that. And then the other part of it is that like the counterexample of the societies now, with varying levels of deep corruption, but it's Croatia. Croatia, from where I'm from, um, it functions largely because it doesn't have ethnic minorities because of the war, and that you can extrapolate that even further to all the democracies of Central and Eastern Europe. That World War II and all the barbarities and cleansings and murders and all the rest of this created viable states out of these places, and they function because of the orgies of ethnic cleansing that made it possible. And so it's that ugly truth that I think too many people don't want to accept, and why I, in general, agonism, all good and fine if you have faith in some sort of process. I just it's not human nature, and I guess the saving grace of America has been a certain kind of American identity and idea that that idea and the identity are sort of twinned, and something we've talked about a lot on this show. But it's I wonder. I just wonder. I wonder whether the American miracle snaps not in November, not in December, 10 years, 15 years. Because if you take the longer look at it, I don't think we're on a steady state of agonistic democracy, which muddles through, and we're still better off than anyone else as a result. I wonder if we're not on a glide path down.
Yeah, and that's why just hearing you describe that, it makes me think that what we're about to see in the coming 30 years will be one of the most remarkable and potentially frightening experiments of the modern era. It could be remarkable in a positive way that we could be the one exception to the rule, the one country, because of our exceptionalism, that was able to survive and prosper despite the breaking down of a national identity. That these sub identities would grow, but we would somehow still be successful. Now, what does successful mean in this context? I guess that's also part of the question. But I think we're going to test the proposition of how much division and agonism a country can sustain without disintegrating. And I still have this faith that America is capable of doing what other countries haven't been able to do. And I guess we'll find out. And there's just really no way of knowing. I mean, but we all have agency in this too. I mean, we're going to be protagonists in this struggle. And by you, I mean just people like me and you who are engaged in these debates. We all have agency. The collective of the individuals who form elite opinion or who form counter elite opinion, we have choices to make about how we engage in this very divisive debate. And I just hope people will make better decisions. I hope, again, because I focus on my own side, I hope Democrats will make better decisions and folks on the left will make better decisions about not being maximalist, about acknowledging that conservatives and Republicans should have some part in power, that there should be, so, and this goes back to what we were talking about, I think last week to some degree, who has cultural power, who has political power. And, when we think about division of power, we have to think about it in terms of not just who has electoral office, but who also has a say in mainstream institutions. And this is where I think leftists or normie Democrats should say, hey, Republicans and conservatives are not beyond the pale. They should be able to play a role in culture. And I think so far, one thing that has pushed conservatives away and made them really paranoid and made them want to seize more power for themselves is this sense that we're not allowing them to have a share in cultural power and in cultural institutions, including academia, the arts, film, movies, whatever it might be.
How do you personally conceptualize the role of individuals in all of this? Because you say, like, you and I have a role, etc. But I don't mean individuals like us. I mean political leaders. And I mean individuals, not leadership, not elites, but individuals. Because it strikes me that's one of those things that Machiavelli goes on about that to a certain extent. I mean, it's about the personality who founds orders, and it's something that democratic discourse is pretty shitty about, I think, because it focuses on these bigger forces and legitimation by the people. It almost, anthropomorphizes the people as some sort of agent, when in fact, the people, when if one is to grant that they should be anthropomorphized, it's like a schizophrenic, moaning mute beast of a creature. It's not a real person, the people. And so, I keep falling back on that question of, like, what is the role of individuals? And, you just like look back in the last, what, 12 years. And before that, who, I don't know, it's, everyone's like trying to revisit George W. Bush and get a sense of the guy and, like, say that maybe, it's not as bad as it was. But I mean, in many ways, he was sort of a non-entity, he's not really a leader. He was like a friendly, goofy guy that had enough charisma that he appealed to certain people, but he wasn't really a leader, though he liked to think of himself as a decider. Obama was much more of a I think a self-consciously he conceived himself as a leader. Now, one can say that he pulled it off poorly, but I think there is an Obama, like, an attempt to shape things, and I think Obama still conceives himself as someone who shapes events and things, and in that sense, I think is a more consequential person. I mean, going back to Bill Clinton, I think he too is somehow more consequential. We can't say that Trump is anything but a very consequential individual. I imagine that Biden's not going to be very consequential for all sorts of reasons. So that also suggests to me that, we're in for not a particularly, hopeful time going into this. But how do you see the role of like individuals in shaping these sorts of destinies? Or you think it's actually irrelevant, just comes out in the wash because democracy?
Well, I mean, didn't our friend Ben Judah write an interesting piece comparing Biden to some Russian autocrat leader?
Yes. Yes, you did. It was Brezhnev. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just messing around. It was
Yeah.
Brezhnev.
Yeah.
But I don't really know a lot about Brezhnev, but I thought it sounded to me like, from what I do know about him, this idea, like, he was kind of like an old, like, bobbling leader who he sort of marked the end of an era. Is that fair to say? He was sort of a transitional character in a broader story.
But in the broader story, right, is that I mean, that was the huge problem for the Soviet Union, is that their leadership cadres were exhausted by the time it fell apart. It is interesting that Gorbachev did represent the new generation. He just fucked it up, basically. I mean, that's an unpopular thing to say. Everyone says he's a man of peace, and he managed a new glory of humanity to emerge because he was in his heart a liberal or something like that. That's false, though. He was in his heart a communist, and he wanted to reform the system. He was enthusiastic about it and thought he saw the way. He just fucked it up, and it all fell apart on him. But basically, the struggle for the Soviet Union is that they had no leadership, like from Brezhnev on. It was a bunch of sclerotic old apparatchik types who really, I mean, actually, it's a good point to bring in the Soviet Union, because in many ways, it's something that Lenin and Stalin set up, and a bunch of people then just were system operators after that, and there wasn't any sort of sense of leadership, that like any sense to shape and reshape. Gorbachev was a man who, I think, thought that he was able to shape and reshape, but he got completely steamrolled by the world, by events. He mismanaged it. Yeltsin was definitely a character that that was a shaper of history, and he left his mark. By the end of the time, of course, he was drunk and a mess, and Russian society then yielded up Putin, another very singular leader who has shaped things and events, I would say. So yeah. So what about Brezhnev and Biden?
Um, uh,
No, I'm
well,
asking
well,
how do you look at leaders, the role of individuals? How
well.
important is
Look, I
that?
think that I mean, Trump has changed my view on this to some extent, and Trump demonstrates that even though we have a constraining system that circumscribes what individuals can do in theory, in practice, you can have an unusual figure like Donald Trump who actually changes the course of a nation through sheer force of will. Although I don't even know if force of will is the right way to describe what Donald Trump does, but someone who is so unshackled by norms and normal considerations of what is appropriate that things that previously weren't possible become possible. So that's a lesson for me to take more, or all of us really, to take more seriously the power of idiosyncratic individuals who come once in a lifetime. Donald Trump, someone like him, will never come again because he's a totally singular figure. But it's enough for that one singular figure to come at one particular moment in a very unlikely way. And then all of our lives will never be the same. And
But
that's a remarkable thing to really absorb intellectually, I think.
but that's again, like the question there is maybe take a step back and look. You had Kennedy, uh, LBJ as well, in his own way, though in a very different way. You had Nixon, force of nature. Then you had like two nothings after him. Then you had Reagan, another force of nature. Then you had HW, who I think for my tastes, I quite like how he where he was coming from, where his team was coming from on a lot of issues. But overall, there's a real vacuum there. The vision thing that he joked about himself, like as a real sort of like personality vacuum. Clinton fills it to a certain extent, flawed person that he is, but he fills it. He's a larger than life character that to a certain extent shapes the moment. That's one of those things I should have Ben Haddad on again, because I think he talks about this really well. But it's the role of the leader, the charismatic leader that actually politics depends on it. I think a lot of political scientists who study democracy, for example, like to airbrush that stuff out. But ultimately, the fate and the health of societies is very much, I think, in the hands of individuals, perhaps. Not that, again, that Trump is, he's as much, like I said, I think a symptom of deeper trends. You couldn't have had Trump elected in 1990, but he was there, and we got him now. But I wonder, it's like it's when I get pessimistic and say we're on like a glide slope down a lot of this. I do think that, to your point about the 60s, and we recovered from that.
Well,
In
have
many ways,
we?
well, arguably, it's Reagan's sunny personality and his larger than lifeness that actually managed to pull it together, and then did set a kind of consensus that Obama was very conscious about, saying that he wanted to be the Democratic Reagan. He wanted to be the one that like reordered the world and the whole sort of way we talk about politics for the next generation. I don't think he managed to do that, but he was
Yeah.
consciously trying to. So
Well,
again, it's like maybe that's the road to hope, is to think about like that's what saves us, not democracy, not agonism, not that like democracy organizes our sort of mutual enmities in the best sort of way, and therefore, as long as democracy is around, we're bound to be healthy. We need to hope that we have sound leadership, and not leadership in the sense of sound elites, but in fact a sound individual emerging that reorders things.
well, I have a lot to say to that. I do want to ask you about Barack Obama, because here is a charismatic individual who in some sense has become more and more irrelevant with every passing month and year since he left office. Someone who had such promise and was a singular figure in his own particular way, his, unusual story, his brilliance as far as we can tell. And no, and I shouldn't even say as far as we can tell. I think it's
He's
Obama's
clearly
story.
brilliant. He's
Yeah,
clearly a
yeah,
brilliant guy.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think Obama's story is a story of tragedy, that someone who was among the best and the brightest, someone who I remember feeling at the time in 2008 that we were blessed to have it, almost as if God had sent us because God wanted America to succeed and to recover from the Bush years. But we see what happened, that someone so unusual was constrained by his circumstances. And in some ways, Trump, if he loses, will still be very consequential in various ways. But we might have a conversation 2 or 3 years from now if Biden wins, and we'll say, well, maybe Trump wasn't as consequential as we thought he would be. But we are running out of time, and also we can save some of this for our special second part. And we would encourage our listeners that if you enjoyed this part of the conversation, to consider subscribing for the price of a latte by going to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe and paying $5 a month to kind of get bonus episodes. And also, we hope, bonus articles and posts, which we hope to do in the coming weeks. So consider doing that if you like us and if you enjoyed this episode. Right, Damir?
That's right. Chief Marketing Officer Shadi Hamid.
Wow, it doesn't come naturally to me.
It's getting
hard.
easier,
It's
though,
hard.
isn't it? It's getting easier.
Yeah, I hope so.
Capitalism, Shadi. Capitalism.
Yes, a good note on which to end.
Indeed, always.
The
Thanks.
market. Okay,
Yeah.
Damir.
Talk soon.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.